that, and like that. Okay, I think we're on go. We're still waiting for people to come into the room. If you're on Zoom, bear with us for another couple minutes. So we're live and being recorded. Be careful what you say.
All right. Thanks for the warning.
Yeah, we did that.
Completely open now?
Yes.
Or closed so they can come right in.
Yeah,
Thank
that
you,
should be.
Kirsten. Thank you. I won't see you before. Thank you.
I put this out of the way because I don't need it. So you can, if you do this, I think
You can see who's
you'll
there.
see who's there.
Oh.
There may be more people than you can see, but
Right.
there are people tuning in, so it seems like the.
So wait another minute because I think your clock was a couple minutes slower than mine.
And that one says 1 minute.
1 minute to 2 then.
Yeah, that's true. That doesn't say the right time at all. But mine says 1 minute to 12. Yeah.
Give me 1 minute.
You can look. Is that one moving at all, or is it just not moving?
Or back to your lab. Okay, so we can go there after the call.
It did move. For those on Zoom, we'll get going here in just 30 seconds.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the last colloquium of the fall semester. We are delighted to have with us Anna Dornhaus. Anna's main appointment is in EEB, Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. But in addition to that main appointment, she is appointed in at least 8 other units on campus. So Anna defines interdisciplinarity, and one of the units she's appointed in is the Cognitive Science GIDP. I'll just give you a little background on Anna. She earned her PhD in 2002 from the University of Würzburg in Germany. And then from 2002 to 2005, she was a visiting postdoctoral fellow at the University of Bristol in the UK. She was sponsored by 2 fellowships during that time, fellowships awarded to especially promising students. She came to the UA right after her postdoc at the University of Bristol in 2005 and rose up through the ranks. So she's now professor in EEB. Her work has been funded by the NSF and by DARPA. She has mentored many students at every level you can imagine, high school up through postdoc, and is now even working with elementary school children through outreach programs. So she engages in substantial outreach and has done many media interviews. If you're interested in seeing them, she has quite a few of them posted on her website. She has over 100 publications, 120 to be precise, as of the CV we have. And she has been named a local genius by the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tucson. It's a wonderful program they have. Neither of us can remember the year it happened, but it was certainly before 2018 when another colleague of ours was named local genius. Anyway, it is my pleasure to introduce Anna Dornhaus.
Thank you, Mary.
Anna.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks, Mary, for this very kind introduction. And, you know, given that we're all coming back from the pandemic and maybe are scarce on data and haven't been in the lab for a while, I thought I would give a different talk and reach out a little more. Maybe it's also because I'm getting older, and kind of try to pull in a little bit of history and a little bit of other things together with some empirical data from my lab. And so feel free to you know, ask questions, and certainly at the end, I hope we have a little time for discussion. And I want to mention, I didn't schedule to go out for lunch today, but if any of the students in the room would like to have a meeting with me after this, please email me, and I'd be happy to meet on Zoom or meet live somewhere. Okay, having said that, somehow my talk is about cognition, which is appropriate for cognitive science, and I titled it, "Why Isn't Everyone Smarter?" And now I need to advance slides. Let's see if I can still do it. Okay, this is roughly my outline. I don't want you to read all of this right now, but to start with, I'm going to talk a little bit about history, and this is not going to be a comprehensive history, but I just want to leave you with an impression, which is that there has been work, scientific work on behavior and on what goes on in the mind of animals for a long time. This is an example that probably most of you have heard of from Pavlov's dog, right? This is Pavlov, this is his dog. This is an experimental study on learning in the lab. And this is really, I'm not going to review in detail what he all did, but I'm just want to focus your mind on the fact that he's studying this dog that's standing on a table with this weird contraption around him and all that. And then there's another, you know, name you've probably all heard, Fred Skinner. And I know the photo is a little grainy, but here's a rat. And it's in a little metal box, and it's trying to press a lever. And Skinner did a variety of studies on this kind of thing. And this whole research tradition, of which these are just two examples, is really geared towards finding generalizable laws of learning, something about cognition that we can take from animals and apply to humans and maybe apply across the board. But there's a whole different research tradition that's been interested in behavior, and that comes from biology. And biologists generally, they consider multiple founding fathers, and Darwin is the founding father of everything, if not Aristotle. But specifically for behavioral ecology, we generally consider Nico Tinbergen to be the founding father, which was as recently as the 1950s. For me, that seems recent in any case. And he is really known for studying a variety of animals, but emphasizing that it would be good to study them in their natural environment, in their natural surroundings, doing the things that they would actually naturally do. So just to give, he's famous for a lot of things. I want to give you an example because he's probably less familiar to this room than the previous examples. So one of the studies, he's mostly famous for work on birds, but he did a study on wasps. And the study on wasps is whether they have landmark learning. Do they learn to recognize landmarks in order to orient? An experiment that is depicted here, that is his drawing, is very simple. The wasps have a little hole in the ground, and they leave the hole repeatedly to find food, to insect prey that they carry back to the hole. Now, he's interested in whether they use landmarks to find the hole again when they come back. So what he did was, while the wasp was in the hole, he put a little circle of pine cones around this hole. And then the wasp comes back out, and she does something that's called turn back and look behavior, which you can sort of take from this image, which is that he drew the wasp coming out and kind of flying around looking at the pine cones and then flying off to find insects to hunt. And then when the wasp came back, this is the hole, he took the pine cones and made a circle, identical circle of the same pine cones, but moved it over a foot or so away from the nest. And what happened was the wasp came back and looked for her nest in here. And so that's how he showed that they were using landmarks to orient themselves to find their nest entrance. So I'm just giving that as an example for how he was really advocating that we should be studying these learning laws, or this cognition really, although he probably didn't use that word, in the field, in the natural context of the animals. And the tradition that Nico Tinbergen founded has led to many people studying many kinds of behaviors. And the key overarching theme that you cannot escape getting to when you are in that tradition is that there is a huge variety of behaviors in the world among different animals, and that huge variety is largely innate and fixed. Because there are so many things, birds recognizing their babies and being compelled to stuff food into something yellow like that. Termites building incredibly intricate termite mounds with ventilation and so on, where they're blind and cannot even see the whole thing, let alone even walk it. I mean, definitely can't see it, but they also can't walk it. Birds reacting to the silhouettes of birds of prey that they haven't seen before. Blackcaps finding a route from Europe to Africa based on a genetic program. You can even breed them to go more west or more east or go around the Mediterranean one way or another, just in a couple of generations. Fiddler crabs who never see their parents because the eggs are dumped into the ocean and they land on an island somewhere, but they're able to build these intricate mud burrows and then wave to females with their claw after never seeing another adult do this before. What else do I have here? Many people are familiar with dogs. You can breed retrievers rather that retrieve sticks as well as ducks, or pointers that point at the ducks in a very specific posture that is completely genetic. And of course, honeybees do the famous waggle dance, in which they indicate the compass direction and distance of a food source to other bees. Again, they do not need to have any contact with adult bees before they're able to do this. And they do get better over time, but it doesn't have anything to do with somebody telling them how it should work. My final example here, the famous jewel wasp who knows how to sting a cockroach into a precise brain region in order to apply a toxin that would take away the free will of the cockroach and make it the wasp's slave, so the wasp can steer the cockroach by the antennae into her nest, where it will be consumed by the wasp's offspring. So this is just a random hodgepodge of examples of behaviors that biologists find that are specific and intricate and species specific. Okay, why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you this because I want to say that our historical traditional research direction and approach has an incredibly strong influence on what we interpret cognition to be, how we interpret it to work, how prevalent we interpret it to be, and so on. And I would say the binary distinction here is not true anymore. It's true maybe up to the 1990s or something like that. But it certainly used to be the case that people would either come from a biology background, and if they came from a biology background, they're influenced by Tinbergen, and they have in their mind that what you should do is study animals in the wild, in the natural context. Now, if you're doing that, you have no choice but to pick behaviors in animals that you have any chance of seeing in the wild, which means it's not monkeys and it's not rats, because neither of those are easy to find. They're almost impossible to actually see while they're doing whatever they're doing in the wild. So you have to have diurnal animals. You have to have animals that are conspicuous, and that almost certainly means either birds or insects, and in rare cases, fish. So that's what this field focused on, just by necessity of what their approach was. In addition, you have to focus on behaviors that are conspicuous and done in the open and not secretly, which means it's almost all about mating and a little bit about parental care, because those are the things that you can actually see in the wild, and some foraging. And so given the organism and given the behavior, what this field overall found up until 1990, 2000, is mostly a lot of specific stuff, especially mating behavior, almost by definition, is incredibly specific to each species. And if it's a behavior that only one species has, it means it must be innate. Innate in the sense that there must be a detailed genetic program that enables that animal to do it and another animal not, right? I can raise a termite as my child, or a dog for that matter, and they will not behave anything like a human. And that seems trivial, but it's actually not trivial. It means everything that makes her a termite and me a human is genetic. All the differences between us, pretty much all of them, are genetic, right? And that's true for all of this diversity that I showed you in the last slide. On the other hand, if you came from this other tradition, right, you were focused on having highly controlled experiments in the lab. That immediately restricts what animals you can do it on hugely, because most animals can never be kept in the lab, and a lot of them not easily. And it's very hard to switch from whatever your advisor is doing. So this is incredibly focused on, from a biologist point of view, a narrow and unrepresentative subset of species, namely rats and rhesus monkeys and one or two other things. And in addition, they're being studied in an incredibly artificial environment. And this is all necessary if you want to have everything standardized and you want to have experiments that translate across species. Like you don't want to observe some species-specific mating habits, but you actually want to see how learning works across the board, then you have to do this. But that is also then what you're going to find. So you're going to find more generalizable learning laws because that is what you're looking for here. And your focus is going to be on behavioral flexibility, right? Because if they're doing anything in the metal box, it's because they're behaviorally flexible. Whatever they do that's not behaviorally flexible isn't going to work there, and you're not going to see it. So I'm not saying either of these things is wrong. I'm just saying by the very nature of what people started with, what approach they started with, what goals they started with, these two research traditions developed very different ideas about how cognition worked. Okay, and now we're already in the 2020s and the world has changed. And people now know that actually bumblebees can learn to play soccer. And I'm not going to give you a whole review of insect cognition here, but I just have a couple of fun examples. So even very simple small animals can have very plastic behaviors, and they can show a lot of the cognitive skills that we see in animals that we previously had in the lab for a long time. So for example, here, it turns out the easiest way to teach a bee how to play soccer is to pretend to be a bee yourself and play soccer. So the way that these researchers are teaching the bee that it should be caring about the ball and putting the ball in a hole is by having a little plastic bee, fake bee, that appears to be doing this and appears to be successful at it. And then the other bee, the real bee, will learn from that example. So bees can absolutely learn from other bees. And this is just one example that's particularly colorful. That actually comes from the lab of my advisor, my doctoral advisor, Lars Chitka, but he did it after I was there. Okay, and so I've given several actually public lectures in the College of Science series, and they're available on YouTube. And I'm not going to go into all the examples, but you can watch those if you're interested. So essentially all of these things we can find in insects. There is no qualitative cognitive skill that we find in humans that we can't also demonstrate in insects, although in terms of the quantity may well be different. Okay, so conclusion from my first section is that there were these separate research traditions and they arrived at pretty different ideas about how cognition works and how widespread it is and so on. But after they blended, we now realize that it's actually complicated with cognition, right? Some things seem incredibly innate and fixed, and other things are incredibly plastic, and we don't always understand why. We do know the brain contains a good deal of fixed algorithms, as what I just said, but even very small brains are capable of great flexibility. And so to me, that puts a conundrum, right? If even a bumblebee brain, right, which is barely bigger than the little, in fact, it's considerably smaller than the eraser on the back of your pencil, right? If even that brain can do all of those things that are listed, why can't everyone, right? Why isn't every animal as smart as humans are, whatever that means exactly? What is the limit? I mean, it seems like humans were pretty successful in the end, at least. So what is it that limits cognition or somehow influences how much cognition we see? And I'm aware that I'm using a pretty loose definition of that word here. So I just want to give you a couple of empirical examples. So to this general point of biologists have long underestimated cognitive skills, and psychologists maybe have underestimated the success and prevalence of fixed routines and heuristics in the real world. And so I'm now going to talk a little bit about my work on bumblebees. Bumblebees are bees. The queen is about 1 inch or a little more. The workers are a little bit less than that. We mark them with these little number tags. We have artificial flowers in the lab, although every experiment uses kind of a slightly different setup. But we use something like that where we deliver nectar, and this is what they want, and they're very flexible in learning how to get it. And since I have you here as a captive audience, I'm going to mention briefly about their natural history. So they naturally would be nesting underground in these colonies with many individuals that are all sisters from one queen. We have one native bumblebee here in Tucson at the Tucson elevation. It's Bombus sonorus. That's actually considered endangered. So if you have them, you shouldn't trap them. What else do I want to say? The total group of bumblebees worldwide has about 250 species. But in general, Arizona is the hotspot of bee diversity in the world. Arizona alone has about 300 species of different kinds of bees. So if you remember back to my innate behavior slide, every one of these bees could have different behaviors for all we know. Most of them we don't know that much about. This is a poster about North America, so that's not Arizona, but Arizona has even more species of different bees. And also, what you normally know as the bee is the honeybee, which is native to, this particular honeybee is native to Africa and Europe. Humans brought it here, so they're invasive here, but they are common. This is what an example of an American bumblebee is. All the other ones in this picture are wasps. I'm only showing the wasps because as a parent, it's quite frustrating that every single children's book, including Winnie the Pooh, depicts honeybee nests as looking like this, but this is actually a wasp nest. Honeybees never make an envelope around the nest. They only have open combs, and they usually nest in cavities. So next time you see that, you know how biologically inaccurate it is. Okay, anyway, so to give you an example of what we study, so these bumblebees can be trained to artificial feeders that in some remote way resemble a flower. In this case, the point is the bee is exposed to an array of different colored circles, and it's trained to one as a target color, and that's going to be rewarded, and the other ones are not rewarded. In this particular study, we're measuring the decision time, and that includes actually a short flight distance. So it's not just the neural decision time, but behaviorally from entering the gate where she can see the array to actually committing to landing on one of these. And the decision time across different bees correlates with the percentage of correct choices they make. And so this was a deliberately hard decision task. This is not the actual colors. I just use them for this slide, but the colors are pretty similar to each other. So the choice is hard, and the fastest bee is basically at 50% correct, so it seems to be guessing, whereas the slowest bee gets a higher accuracy. Now, if you redo the same experiment with the exact same bees, but you make it so that the wrong color, instead of just being empty or having water, instead of sugar solution, has quinine in it, so it's bitter, something the bees really don't like, it's just making the error more costly. If you make the errors more costly, they all increase in accuracy, and they all increase in time. So the point here is there's a speed accuracy trade-off, but individual bees not only start out being different in terms of how they choose to be on the speed accuracy trade-off, but also when the conditions change, they're able to flexibly navigate that and adaptively change the decision about how fast to be and how accurate. Now, after this paper came out that I did together with Lars Sitka and somebody else, another author took the same data from the same paper, just from a theory point of view, and calculated, well, given some reasonable assumptions and the measurements made here, what is their actual success rate? How much sugar do they actually collect in an hour of making these decisions over and over again? And his point is, I put the legend here, I put the dots on the same legend so you can translate it. But basically, if you just look at one color at a time, so black is one experiment. So in the black points here, that's one experiment. Bees differ in accuracy. And this is the overall projected nectar collection rate if they visit a lot of these flowers for an hour. The nectar collection rate actually basically doesn't correlate with accuracy at all. If anything, correlates negatively. So in other words, they sacrifice too much speed for a little bit higher accuracy. And if they just do fast, wrong decisions, it doesn't matter if a lot of them are wrong because they can visit more flowers total. And so what he showed was that in the bitter condition, right, all of them increase accuracy. It goes to the open circles. And they actually do increase the nectar collection rate, but the between bee difference still is not, the between bee difference and accuracy is not terribly predictive of their nectar collection rate. So my point with this slide and this study is to say that, well, on this point of why doesn't everybody have more learning, more cognition, whatever it is. In this case, if the cognition has something to do with how accurate you can be on this decision-making task, it turns out the accuracy is not unequivocally good. In fact, in many cases, it's more effective to accept the fact that you're going to make a lot of errors, but then you can go through faster and make more decisions and collect the same amount or more nectar. Okay, and here's an undergrad project that we did recently, just to give you more recent data, showing something different and yet similar. And my point here is going to be that it's not just a time cost, but an attention cost. And if you're distracted because, for example, the environment is more distracting rather than simple, the more complicated cognitive tasks may become harder, or the bees may just choose not to do them. So in this case, what we're doing in this study is we're giving the bees a series of kind of innovation tasks. Are they going to go to, first, are they going to be, if they're trained on these yellow flowers, are they able to go to the yellow flowers in a distracting or simple environment? If they're trained on the yellow flowers, will they investigate a new type of flower that appears? So how much tendency and ability to innovate when there's new resources do they have? And then in this case, if the flowers are trained on disappear, but this one very odd flower appears that requires a novel handling technique in order to yield its nectar. And this is just craft foam, and they have to go in the middle of some odd shape, or they have to remove a lid in order to access the nectar. And some bees manage to do this and some don't. But the bottom line is, if there's distractions in the environment, they either don't do it or they take much longer. So there seems to be this cost to distractions, this resource of attention or whatever that is, that prevents them sometimes from solving a cognitive problem. And then maybe similarly, this is a study on humans, which my postdoc David Kikuchi did in collaboration with his former advisor in Canada. So the humans weren't in my lab, but it's a very similar study to what we might do with bees. It has these different stimuli that vary on a variety of dimensions. And I'm just giving you a very short summary here of the study, but the point is, if the environment becomes too diverse, in other words, if there are too many stimuli that vary on too many things, the humans in this case do not bother to figure out, it's just the yellow stars that have the highest reward. They just end up using a key trait like star shape or yellow color, even though in a lot of cases that key trait will be giving them the wrong answer. So they wrongly generalize, but it saves them from having to pay attention to multiple traits. So just like the bees, the humans in this task are accepting the fact that they're going to make a higher rate of errors in favor of reduced cognitive processing. So reduced having to pay attention to different dimensions of the stimuli. And this was, in this case, triggered similar to this study by the complexity of the environment. So if there are a few different stimuli used, then humans will learn exactly which ones have the reward. If there are too many diverse stimuli, they stop doing that and focus on a key trait. Okay, so this was all different empirical results on this general idea that it's complicated, on the general idea that cognitive skills broadly defined may be useful or may not be useful. And actually, there seems to be considerable malleability as to whether an individual type of animal, bees or humans or whatever, will use them even when they're generally available. Okay, now I want to give you another separate idea on the benefit of biases or fixed behaviors, in addition to the kind of cost and attention savings. This was also in a study on bumblebees, but I'm going to first make a general argument. So my general argument is, okay, generally, especially in these simple learning studies, we imagine learning works like this. There's some variety of solutions you can have to a problem, and maybe you're starting here and you try some different solutions and you find that these ones work a little bit better than those. And so then you try those and you try around here and you find these ones work a little better. And so you climb the hill of getting better and better at the task and getting more and more reward, right? So it's a fairly easy, greedy algorithm, almost like evolution. But what if the curve actually looks like this? What if, yes, there is there are solutions that will solve the problem and give you a high reward. But right now you're here and you're trying a lot of things, but none of them work. How do you actually know? How do you actually get there, right? In terms of a hill climbing algorithm, you'd have to spread incredibly far from here. And if you imagine this is actually multidimensional and just not one line, it might be pretty hard to know how to do that. And it could be even worse, which is this, right? What if you're playing the piano? You don't play the piano. You play the piano 10 times and it sounds awful, right? So the reward, not only is there no reward, it's actually terrible and frustrating and everybody hates you. How do you ever get here? And how does a bee ever get there when there is no straight path that works with hill climbing? And what I'm going to argue here is that innate biases can actually ferry you through that, push you through that. And in this particular study, I'm sorry I don't have a photo, but we used an artificial flower that looks almost tulip shaped. So it's kind of like a cup, but with petals, and the bees have to pry the petals apart to get to the nectar reward on the inside, on the bottom. But we did two versions of that flower. In one case, we glued the petals together so that the reward was just right on the outside. And I'm going to call this the simple flower, and this is the complex flower. And the gist of it is, this is hard for the bees to learn, and it has that red curve shape, in that when they first try to learn it, they don't get anything. And this is simple because they pretty quickly figure out where the nectar is. And we did the experiment with a choice between two flowers, a pink one and a purple one. Actually, there's an array, but there's pink flowers and purple ones. And either one or the other is simple and the other one is complex. Now, it turns out the bees prefer purple. So bees have innate color biases. So they prefer innately certain colors over other colors. This is very well established. And when the purple flowers were the simple ones, even after a long period of training, 100% of the bee choices were on the purple. Because if they ever got nectar from a simple purple flower, they never did anything else. They never went to the pink flowers again. Now, what if the purple flower is actually complex? So in other words, the purple one is the one where you have to drill down and find the nectar at the bottom. And this part of the graph is where the rewards are the same. In this part of the graph, the rewards on the complex are actually higher. And the bottom line is that when the rewards are the same, a lot of them end up on the pink, even though they don't like pink, but just because the pink is the easy one to do. And the purple is complex, but some of them do both. But if the rewards are higher on the complex, then more of them end up on the purple complex flower. And the bottom line of this whole study is they never get through the valley unless their bias predisposes them to the complex flower. So they only ever learn the complex flower when that complex flower is purple, the color that they innately prefer. If the complex flower is a color that they don't innately prefer, they will immediately give up on it once they go into that valley. So once they don't get anything, they don't go to it anymore. Okay, so without too much detail on the study on why there's these different results, but the point is this initial bias enables the bees to overcome their frustrating phase of learning to play the piano or learning to actually get down in here without getting any rewards because they keep trying. Okay, so that was my point here on biases may actually promote complex learning. And a little bit, I should have said this, but my theme here is to say, not only is it complicated, but fixed behaviors and sort of cognitively complex behaviors are not the dichotomy that we often think of them as, or not even a spectrum. Very often they intertwine in complicated ways, and this is one example of that. Okay, now just a brief general point. So in one of the public lectures, I took these examples. So we know many examples from biology where cognitive skills seem incredibly detailed, in a detailed way evolved to the specific habitat of the animal. For example, there's these sticklebacks where the ones that are benthic, meaning living in the open ocean or in the open water, are incapable of learning landmarks because they never encounter any, but not in their personal history. You can keep them in an aquarium their whole life and they will never learn landmarks. Whereas the ones that live on the bottom, the ones that are either in shallow streams or they just are bottom dwellers, where there are landmarks, are predisposed to learning landmarks. So sticklebacks that evolved in this habitat, so these are different species. These have a different genetic makeup to their brain, and their brain and landmark learning is not part of that repertoire, but it is for these guys. Famously, rats are really good at learning odor avoidance if food is poisoned. Vampire bats are incapable of learning that, simply because blood is not usually poisoned. They're not trying out new foods. They have an incredibly specialized food that's never bad. It can't spoil when you get it fresh. There's a study on pinion jays that shows that female pinion jays, when they're married, forget everything because their husband knows, but when they're divorced, they have to remember by themselves, and they do. So all kinds of very specific adaptations to the specific habitat and lifestyle of the animal. And of course, in general, the conclusion from evolutionary biology is that animals evolve towards higher fitness in actual environments. And this may or may not involve actually learning, or what we think of as correct learning, or correctly understanding the world. Sometimes that is not necessary. Sometimes a heuristic or no strategy at all is sufficient to get the same performance. Yeah, that's what I say here. And there's a recent paper from Houston and McNamara, who are theorists, but they argue here that behavioral ecologists have built complex models of optimal behavior in simple environments. We argue that they need to focus on simple mechanisms that perform well in complex environments, because the real world is actually complex. And very often a simple strategy may actually work perfectly well. Okay, so to show you some data that from my lab, on sort of on this vein of tuning how much learning or how much cognition, broadly speaking, you want to use happens in response to different environments, even within the lifetime of individuals. So here again, we're talking about bumblebees, and we made this repeated Y maze, basically. It's really a very long tunnel that has repeated decision points between two food sources. And we make them go through it up to 100 binary choices. So the bee is making 100 choices in a row, which is not, it's atypical for them that they would walk, but they are willing to do it. It's not atypical for them to do 100 choices, because a bee typically in a foraging flight will visit hundreds of flowers. Okay, so the bee is repeatedly choosing between yellow and blue, and although it doesn't look that way in this photo, but they are randomly switching at each decision point. But one color is consistently better until the environment changes. We determine with not dice, but a random number generator when the environment changes. And when the environment changes in that sequence of 100 choices, the other color becomes the better one. And we tested different rates of environmental persistence. In other words, we tested different probabilities of changing the environment on each go through. And the bottom line here is, again, that bees are responsive to this. When the environmental persistence goes up, the bee's probability of switching goes down. So in other words, the more stable the environment is, the more the bee will just stick to the one color that it has determined is better. Whereas if the environment switches a lot, you know, the way we define it here, 60% environmental persistence means almost at every round, you would expect it to switch which color is actually better. And so here they're basically at 50% sampling choices. So meaning they often go to the other color, whichever the other color is. Okay, yeah, so my point here is to say that the bees choose more randomly when the environment changes frequently, but when the environment is stable, they learn and they stick to their choice of what they determined has been the better choice. Similarly, we see quite a lot of flexibility with regard to what cues to even use. In this previous experiment, really the only cue they can use is the color. But we've done other experiments. In this case, it is this was in part about the topic of social environment and social learning, and how much bees copy other bees. We used dead, dried out bumblebees as fake model bees. So we have 4 types of flowers. We have 2 different colors, and we either have a bee on it or not. And so in this environment, we tested every possible or a bunch of possible combinations of whether or not the color reliably indicates whether there's sugar in the flower, or the bee reliably indicates whether there's sugar in the flower. So these two independent cues can independently vary in their reliability. And the bottom line here is the bees can use either cue, and they do use either cue flexibly depending on how reliable it actually turns out to be. So on this graph, we have here a case where social reliability is 50%, which means since there's only two options, that's not informative whether or not there's a bee on the flower. And in the first column of each graph is floral reliability, 50%, which again means the color is not predictive of whether there's food in the flower. And the key pattern you're supposed to see here is if the social reliability is high, they generally significantly use presence or absence of bee as a decision-making factor for where they're going to land. Whereas they use the flower color only if the social reliability is very low. So they're able to use both cues. They have a preference for, if they're both equally reliable, they seem to have a preference for the social cue, but they can use both cues if the other cue is unreliable. So there's flexibility in, there seems to be pre-programming on preferring to use social cues, but there's flexibility also in terms of which cue to use to make decisions. Okay, and this plays into this general theme of knowing what's worth knowing. So these were two cases where bees make decisions about whether to learn, or at least whether to behave according to what they've learned. There's another study that I'm mentioning here where bees do this turn back and look behavior that I described before for wasps when they're reorienting. So when the environment has changed, they show this specific behavior of seemingly trying to memorize what the environment now looks like. And bees will also do that when they leave their hive if the environment has changed. So they must know something about whether the environment looks the same, in which case it's not necessary to re-memorize the landmarks, or whether the environment has changed, in which case they do have to re-memorize, or rather learn for the first time what the landmarks now look like. Okay, so this was all empirical data on mostly on bumblebees, arguing for the fact that cognition and learning and using sophisticated problem-solving strategies sometimes happens and sometimes doesn't happen, and there seems to be quite a bit of flexibility as to whether to use it or not. And so what I want to now address, and I don't have a definite answer, but I'm just going to provide some arguments, is what is actually the limiting factor? What is the thing that makes these sophisticated problem-solving strategies expensive? And I've had a lot of discussions with computer scientists actually about this and roboticists, right? Because in robotics, for example, there's also a question of how much do you try to program for every contingency into this robot? How much is it necessary for the robot, or a software for that matter, to have an explicit algorithm about all the logical contingencies about what the world actually looks like? How much does it need to understand what the real world is, rather than using just one fits-all heuristic? And when is it good, and when is it worth doing that? And generally in computation, an important insight of the last years, and I'll provide more evidence, is that it's not computation that's limiting. The actual calculations, the actual logical deductions are not hard and can be done cheaply with the processing power we have. What's expensive in robots is moving, because they're not good at moving. And what's also expensive is data collection. And so now I kind of want to make the argument for animals that I think the expensive part is the data collection. In order to build a complete model of the world, the expensive part is data collection. The expensive part is not the computation. We know all these animals can do all the computations because they do them under the right conditions. It's not somehow that they don't have the brain equipment to calculate something. It's that they don't have the input data. So that's my argument. Okay, so first, this is actually kind of from one of my public lectures, to say that to motivate this need for data in the first place. And that is that I think that a folk interpretation of how the mind works is that there's a little homunculus in your brain that makes decisions. That's the irreducible intelligence part. And then that your intelligence is somehow rational, that it is actually about building a complete model of the world and then calculating what the best next move is. And I'm going to argue that actually both of these things are wrong. I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but you all know the brain is doesn't in fact have a little person in it, or not in the sense of a little homunculus at least. It is a brain that's made of neurons. And if you cut it apart, there's no person left. So somehow, whatever the person is emerges from this group interaction of neurons. And that's what I call distributed cognition. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that now. But I'm going to make the maybe a little more controversial argument that also the rational intelligence view is kind of wrong and only occasionally works. And mostly what we're doing is actually machine learning. And a lot of people argue that machine learning is not like a brain. I think the opposite is true. The brain is more like machine learning than we want to believe. And what is machine learning? It's basically example-based heuristics. I understand what a chair is by seeing thousands of chairs from thousands of angles, or millions, or billions. It is not because I ever have a logical definition of what a chair is. And the same is true for bees, and the same is true for making decisions between blue and red flowers and all of the other things. That's my argument. Okay, so I want to give a couple of arguments towards that. I hope I'm not going too much over time. So first of all, Mary's here. So I know a lot of you know that this is not actually how we see the world. And in fact, in case you don't know, if you stretch out your hand in front of you at about arm's length, and assuming your hand's about 10 centimeters and arm's about 1 meter, the only thing that you see in color is what's covered by your hand. So if you do that right now on this slide, and you focus on your hand, you will not be able to make yourself believe that there's no color outside your hand. But that is a fact. That's irrefutable. It has nothing to do with the brain and everything to do with the fact you don't have color receptors anywhere else. So all the color you imagine you're seeing is what you're imagining. In fact, it's what you're remembering to some degree. But it is that now we have the view that people who work on this have the view that the perception, what we perceive to be perception, is actually mostly predictive algorithms running in your brain. And that only slightly gets modified from actual outside input. The second thing I want to say about this rational model of the world is it doesn't work. It's actually impossible to perfectly model anything interesting because it's too complicated. And it's not just complicated in terms of many factors playing a role, but also small differences in input often have large differences in output, which means any system that's like that becomes incredibly unpredictable, even with a very good model of it. And I'd be happy to talk more about it, but I'm not going to go into too much detail. But this is sort of an insight from complexity science that's well established. And then finally, my other argument about the data rather than the rules is, in actual fact, in artificial intelligence, we tried to build artificial intelligence based on rule-based logic for decades, and we got nowhere. And we were proud of the thing could win at chess. But since we started thinking, well, this is not the way to go, since computer scientists accepted the fact that what they needed was machine learning, or it wasn't always called machine learning, but the point is what they needed was to collect absolute shitloads of data and then extrapolate from those. The artificial intelligence took off, and we now have self-driving cars and all kinds of things that you guys think are obvious, but that 20 years ago were unthinkable. And this is because we abandoned the idea that we need a complete model of the world. And we accepted the idea that we're just going to use as many examples as we can and learn from those and apply this fuzzy logic to them. Okay. So this is my argument that lots of problems can only be solved and can best be solved with a lot of data and example-based heuristics instead of these completely rational models. And now, how does that lead to limitations on cognition? My argument that I want to make in this talk is that collecting that data is actually pretty expensive. In the AI realm, we were able to do it because we got Google and we got millions of people to put stuff on the internet, right? And then now that became this great database. But if you're thinking you're a bee, right? What we think of here as errors or random choices may also be deliberate exploration. Maybe the bee deciding, well, I need to check on yellow again because I haven't been there in a while and maybe it's changed. And this is in an incredibly simple environment. In a real environment, there will be hundreds of different types of flowers And every one of them is hard to learn to actually handle in order to even figure out if it has nectar. So collecting that data in any kind of complete way is impossible. I just put Bob up here because he has this famous paper on the 85% rule for optimal learning. So he's saying if you're making less than 15% mistakes, you're doing it wrong because you're not sampling enough the other strategies. And in actually collaboration with Bob Wilson, a student of Bob's, JM, has been studying directed exploration in bees, and we've actually shown, I think convincingly, although it's not published yet, that in a situation where bees have more information about one choice than another, they seem to prefer the more informative option, even independently of the expected reward. So they prefer the option that they calculate has a higher expected reward, but if that is, that being equal, they prefer the more informative option. So they seem to deliberately be collecting data. But like I just said, deliberately collecting data in the real world is still incredibly hard. And so that may be one of the limiting factors for sort of complete rational models of the world, that updating and having complete knowledge is incredibly expensive because of the costs of collecting new data. Okay, which is why I'm arguing that bees are Bayesian. So if you know what that means, it means that you use both the knowledge you already have, which may be innate biases, combined with updating it with whatever little, even very little new information you have in order to conclude what the best action will be. Okay, and so I know I'm out of time, so I'm not going to really talk about this, but just to say briefly that we know that bees integrate new data with old biases. So for example, on color, I told you they have color preferences that are well known. It's also well known that they prefer blue over yellow. And so for example, if you train them on a flower color, this is the new data, the innate bias is the old data. They combine that. If the old data says, their innate bias says blue is better, the new data also says blue is better, they pretty much don't bother to look at anything else. If the new data says yellow, so the old bias and the new data conflict with each other, then they remain very open about all the possibilities and investigate new flowers more quickly. So I'm out of time, otherwise I would go into more detail on this, but there's a variety of data that show that bees will have all kinds of innate preferences, but they will be integrated with new data to update a new version of the world. Okay, and that's just my thank you slide to all my group members. And thank you for the attention.
Nana, thank you very much. Okay, as usual, we're going to take questions first from people in the room. But if you're on Zoom, please do raise your hand and we'll get to you sooner or later if you have a question. Excuse me, students first.
Hi, thank you so much for that presentation. It was wonderful. I just wondered, oh, okay. Hopefully y'all can hear me on Zoom. Again, thank you so much for the presentation. I was just hoping you could speak about the current climate crisis and future of bees in regard to some of the studies that you'd showed us, and that when they experience some reward valleys, they tend to give up. I think in the future of the naturalistic environment, it might become either more risky or food sources might become more scarce. I was wondering what sort of behaviors would they sort of sacrifice accuracy even more, or would they favor a lower cognitive effort to go for what they are more used to? I just see a discrepancy between their future and just sort of, yeah, thank you.
So the question is about climate change and how bees will be able to adapt given what I said. And the answer is it's complicated actually. Bumblebees and honeybees specifically are incredibly generalist, which is partially why we're using them for these experiments. So I actually think that among all the different bees that I showed the big slide off in the beginning, they're probably going to be ones that adapt better just in terms of things like flower choice and flowers blooming that they aren't used to. If you're asking about cognitive ability specifically, I think the key point that every biologist that's interested in climate change is interested in is, will evolution be fast enough to keep up with the change Or will animals migrate northwards to sort of stay in the same type of habitat, but just be somewhere else? And then maybe some of the most northern ones will go extinct. Or will neither of those processes be fast enough to compensate for the climate change? And the answer may well be different for different species. And for insects, generally, it's pretty complicated. Some people argue that they will reproduce faster when it's warmer, and some say that the mismatch between them and their habitat will be too great. And of course, the whole migrating north or adapting by evolution only works if it happens to all the species that they depend on as well as themselves. So this is all the complicated part. If you're interested in bee conservation concretely here, I mean, here in Arizona, the problem is the water goes away, right? And so that's not, no amount of cognitive adjustment, evolutionary or otherwise, will compensate for that, right? So if the water is gone, the bees will go extinct. And also, if you have too much monoculture, there just won't be enough stuff blooming throughout the year. Even if they're able to learn every flower there is, if there's periods in the year that are too long, when nothing is blooming that they can eat from, then they also go extinct. So those are kind of the conservation questions there. But it's an interesting question generally, and we have yet to see the answer. But for bumblebees, if it's just limiting on the cognitive front, they're going to do better than all the other bees. Any other questions?
Sarah, we can go and take questions from people who are not students.
Thanks. So you had talked about two answers to what might be too expensive and switching from a kind of simple problem solving to something more complex, right? That there's data or computation might be the problem. I guess I was wondering about another way in which more complex learning behaviors might be expensive, which is that if you think about what it's required to keep trying during the learning trough, sometimes having that capacity, like I think you see this in comparing model-based and model-free systems, having the capacity to say, I'm going to keep trying for like 10 years until I get it right, also can lead to like really catastrophic failures, right? In a way that it seems like there's a kind of asymmetry between the kinds of mistakes that you might make with the simple and the more complex. So I guess, do you see that as another?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's an investment to even get through this that depends on maybe on the length of time as well as the deepness of the cost. Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you say. In this case, in this particular system, right, this part of the answer that I gave JD, bumblebees are great for this, in part because everything that happens on this graph is on a time scale of a few hours, maybe. But some of them never get through the trough. So I guess in fairness, I don't know how long it would take for them to do it if they were going to do it. But the ones that do learn it, do it, you know, maybe in 100 visits, but that's 100 visits in a couple of hours. They do live for several weeks, and they make thousands of flower visits, possibly in a day. So in terms of the future payoff, the horizon for how long this information can be used, it depends a lot on how long these flowers are going to be blooming for, if these are flowers. But in terms of the lifespan of the bee, they certainly have the capacity to make good on whatever that initial investment was. Especially since even a few microliters difference in the per flower reward will make a huge difference in the long run for them if the flower is open long enough. But it's a very accurate statement that how long will you be able to use this information for once you pay that learning cost is a critical piece of information. Yeah.
Complex learning. So you told us early on that the bees could learn a complex task only when the color of the flowers, I guess it was a color they were biased to prefer. So
yeah,
now once they've learned it in the purple, the color they are biased to prefer, can they then generalize to pink or some other color because they've learned this complex task already?
So people argue that bees can generalize, but they usually mean from one color to a similar color. In this particular experiment, they never generalized. And of course, it might depend on all kinds of particulars, but I actually think that they, on an individual level, are very flower constant. So what that means is once they figure out a good thing, especially if it's complicated to learn, they pretty much stick to it until they can't anymore. So usually the possible generalizing only happens when this one is not available anymore. And that would be an interesting experiment, though, if we got them to learn it on the purple, took away the purple and put pink complex flowers on there to see if any generalization would happen. And I anticipate it would, but we didn't do that here. So I
think what you told us about later in the talk suggests that it would, right? Because,
and generally, honestly, I didn't think of these flowers as being that complex, right? They're just, they have to go through the petals here. But if you know anything about flowers, there's incredible mechanisms where you have to push a lever and you have to pry something open and stuff like that. There's a lot of different versions. There's also simple flowers, but a lot of flowers make it somewhat complicated because the flower does not want the bee to go to anything else, right? The flower wants the bee to be specialized. So the flowers have all these mechanisms to force only the bees that are willing to specialize on them to come. And so if you're looking at the real world, let me go back to my flower field here. It seems, for all that I say they forage for a few weeks, but it seems impossible for them to even attempt to learn 10 of these, right? Maybe 2 different ones the bee is willing to learn. And so that's my argument for why I think they must generalize to some degree, otherwise it would take really long. But we don't actually know kind of in the wild, how long does the bee spend in training and how long does the bee forage successfully? And actually, in a different talk on division of labor that I'm also very interested in and why anyone would specialize, it's been shown, not by me, but it's been shown by other people that in honeybees, their whole life, their performance keeps improving in foraging. So they get better at foraging every day of their lives until they die, which is not actually, we think of it as typical for, professors get better at professing, but I don't mean that ironically, but I do think that most tasks aren't like that, right? Most tasks are like riding a bicycle. You learn it and then you're done, and then you just do it. But foraging is something that they keep learning and improving.
And do you think that's because they explore about 15% of the time, going back to Bob Wilson's work?
I think it is because they keep exploring. Yeah, and it is because the flowers actually change quite often. They're pretty short-lived.
Thank you. Okay, another question. Ritwik.
Thanks for the talk, really interesting. So I was thinking about like the very last bit where you spoke about rational intelligence versus example-based heuristics. And I think it's clearly right that the rational intelligence approach has hit lots of limitations. That's clearly correct. But it seems that that's also true of the big data approach, right? So you spoke about self-driving cars, but we now know, like, unlike say the optimism that some people had in say 2015 or something, now there is much more circumspection about what self-driving cars will achieve, right? So they can maybe do something on the freeways, but they are really bad at city driving, for example.
They're better than humans.
Yeah, I mean, they are, but like, I mean.
So what's the but? I mean, the but is all, I agree with what you're saying, which is that there's resistance to it. But the resistance has nothing to do with cognitive efficiency of the cars. It has everything to do with the fact that we think it's much worse if a self-driving car runs somebody over than if a human runs somebody over.
I mean, there can be other examples. There's an example of the fact that the big data approach has not worked very well in language, for example, right? So there was this huge thing about Peter Norvig and his lab in Google in around 2010 and 11, collecting huge amounts of big data to try to come up with some generalized patterns about language, which has been a spectacular failure. So one can think of lots of examples. The question that I had was that you started the talk with this, I thought, interesting idea that there was some insight coming from behavioral ecology and there was some insight coming from comparative psychology. And progress was made when these insights were in some sense combined, right? Similarly, it seems to me that a similar thing would unfold at this point, where there's some insight coming from the rational intelligence or more broadly rationalist models, and there's insights coming from the big data or let us say empiricist models. And there might be progress when there are ways found to actually combine these insights. Because it does seem to me that we would probably make the same kind of error all over again if we swing away from rational intelligence models all the way into the big data model, because that has some well-known limitations as well. That was the larger question.
Yeah, great. So the question, in case you didn't hear it, is about combining rational intelligence approaches or rational model approaches and this example-based heuristics. I mean, generally, I agree with you. And of course, that's a diplomatic answer in any case. I mean, my larger point, which you know, is that we didn't get anywhere with the rational stuff. And then once we had the big data approach, we got somewhere. I think it's a little bit too early to tell whether there's going to be fundamental limitations on that. So you're right, of course, that there are problems and people aren't progressing as fast as they wanted to. But I think, you know, maybe this is an old person's argument, but I would say we're still progressing pretty fast, right? Relative to where when I was a student, I mean, when I was a student, email was invented, right? So as far as old people can tell, the progress has not slowed down that much, right? But so is big, you know, I have all kinds of criticisms of big data, and I think data scientists aren't trained properly, and I think people should understand statistics and how many mistakes you can make with big data and systematic errors and all that. And if you're broadly referring to any of those things, I agree. But fundamentally, is there going to be a limitation to using an example-based heuristic approach? Is it going to be necessary to have these rational models? I don't know. You may be right. But if you conceive of the brain as something that is example-based, both in terms of the evolutionary history of examples and the current ontogenetic history of examples, I'm not sure, right? I mean, we don't understand how the brain works at all, right? I don't want to offend any neuroscientists in the room, but I feel it's pretty fair to say we don't really know about anything but basic perception, how it actually works and how much of a rational model you have to have in there that you can't get with example-based heuristics. And you know, maybe to give a philosophical answer to your question, this is going to be the big question that you guys are going to have to answer when you're my age.
Online has their hand
Yeah,
up.
any questions from people on Zoom, please feel free to put them in the chat, or if you raise your hand,
Or raise your hand.
Ask them live. If you don't raise your hand in Zoom, then I may not know that you're trying
Well,
to.
There's
are you
Lynn.
looking
Oh,
at-
Lynn, yeah, I got you, Lynn.
Yeah, I
But I
mean,
can't hear you.
Bob and I, you can't hear me well. I'm not
Do
muted.
we actually have a speaker on this?
We do have a speaker on this.
I'm not muted, so I don't know what else to do. Can you not hear
Hold
me?
on 1 second, Lynn, and let me not. Others on Zoom can hear, which suggests that it's just our speaker that's not working.
Yep.
Try that again. Say something.
Can you hear me now?
We have this problem over and over again. I really can't figure out what's going on. Let me read this pink note here.
Aye, aye.
Let me see if the loudspeaker is on. If you want to give feedback, if you want to type your question to make it quicker, you can certainly do that. Otherwise, we're going to troubleshoot here and see if we can figure out how to make a loudspeaker work. And that same is true, Bob, for you. I see you have your hand raised. So if you want to type your question, while we check what speaker is selected.
So can you hear me yet?
Lynn, make some noises again, please.
I'm making noises. I am.
No, not yet. Okay, well.
Others who might have questions, start typing. We'll take Lynn's question first, but if it takes you a while to type yours, please go ahead.
All right.
Yeah, if anyone else in the room can put Zoom on, the people who are on Zoom are saying they can all hear okay.
Well, I can just pose my question
Suzanne,
to
come on
people
up.
on Zoom. I mean,
Okay,
Bob would understand where I'm coming
I
from.
had a complicated question, but it's too hard to type. Simple question, how would you define intelligence, he says. And Evan says, such a simple question, Lynn.
Yeah, and I was deliberately avoiding, obviously, defining anything. I mean, I think broadly for the talk here, I was kind of using a mishmash of cognitive skills and sophisticated problem solving and intelligence. And I won't define it. And basically, I just want you to imagine a spectrum of incredibly hardwired fixed algorithms on one end, and something complicated on the other end. But basically the argument in my talk was that many real things are actually an intertwinement of those different things, and that you can't put it simply on a spectrum. So your question is very fair. I don't have a good answer. I hope that the points in my talk make sense anyway, but my point is that there's something about flexibility versus fixed responses to fixed stimuli that I'm imagining as a gradient. Did you get Zoom to work on that?
Well, JB, one of the students here, that's giving me his computer. But now
so don't unmute yourself, because that'll just lead to feedback. But see if.
Yeah, well, let's move it over here. So
Lynn, do you want to try asking a complicated question?
Well, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, well, that's good news. So this may be stealing Bob's thunder. I mean, the distinction you were making right at the end, actually, and partially in response to the previous question, is much under discussion in psychology, in the sort of debate between model-based versus model-free cognition. And really a question of whether you're just gathering data and behaving, you know, as reinforcement learning algorithms suggest on the basis of the examples you gather, versus whether you have a model, you know, that sort of biases you towards approaching the world in a particular way. The answer obviously is going to be both. So it's just, I mean, it really isn't, you know, so you can go back and forth about, you know, this one can do all of it and that one can do all of it, but, you know, it's pretty clear that the answer is going to be some form of both.
I mean, I agree with you. I think this is similar to the student was asking the question. I don't know your name, I'm sorry. Ludwig? So he was asking, I think in the same direction or similar direction. And I agree with you. We probably actually have both. But I guess my argument is that we have a tendency to overestimate the rational part and underestimate how much you can do with just examples.
No, I think that's entirely fair.
But maybe that depends on your viewpoint of what we currently are doing.
No, just a final comment. Wouldn't you consider the sort of the results of
Bob, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself? Well, I can't talk because now I'm twice in the room.
I think Lynn had a follow-up.
I just had a slight follow-up, which will be very quick. Wouldn't you consider the learning that takes place over the course of evolution to be learning that constructs models, that the result of evolutionary learning are the models, the innate models that animals come to existence with? Why, you know, wouldn't you call those models? They had, et cetera, and that, that's what evolution does.
Yeah, I hear you, and I think I agree with that. I think that in a large part, what evolution constructs in the brain is in some sense a model. I think there's a little bit of a difference between what I was calling rational here and what I think you're referring to with models. And of course, I could also ask what do you mean by model, and that probably is an equally long discussion as the intelligence one.
Turnabout is fair.
I guess what I meant, and I admit to defining it extremely loosely, is something along the lines of a model of the world you know, that has the contingencies in it, that tells me exactly when this happens, this is going to happen. And this is how these factors add together in order to produce this. I don't actually think that that's necessarily what evolution produces. I think what evolution produces is, if I find myself in this situation, I should act this way. And that does not imply that I actually understand how the world works. All it implies is that I understand what is good for me.
Okay. And
those are not exactly the same thing. But yeah, within that framework, I think.
Fair enough. On to Bob.
Okay, Bob.
Yeah, great talk.
Okay, really. Hold on. She has to unmute you again from us.
Unmute me.
Okay, start over now.
Okay, great talk. Really superb. I mean, lots of things I'd love to ask about. I mean, I guess one I guess is more of a comment, but or a relation. My old student Brian Kromenacker was studying mental effort and did some stuff on like when do you learn complex representations versus not, and you know, his sort of idea was that people find thinking hard for precisely the reason that you're talking about, right? That they find thinking hard because it pushes you towards the simpler answer, which is all you need to survive. And I guess, yeah, it just as you were talking about it, sort of, it fits in with, I think, what you're saying about, you know, sort of evolution pushes you that way, but this would be evolution pushing your brain to have, you know, thinking be an effortful thing, you know, this model-based cognition as being effortful.
But I don't know why evolution would push you towards making thinking effortful. I mean, if thinking was doing you any good, evolution should push you towards making it effortless. But
right,
maybe
but
there is no way
too
to make
much.
okay, hold on. She has to unmute you again.
Oh.
No, you have him
yeah,
quiet.
If thinking too much, you know, costs you, right, because you're too slow now, then you don't want to
evolution should push against it. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So
and you know, this is the conundrum that I wanted to kind of point out in this talk, right? Mm-hmm. When is thinking actually a good idea? And I think it's wrong. Yeah. I think there's sometimes this naive view of evolution, which you weren't implying, but I want to clarify that evolution is not just about survival in some simplistic sense, right? It's really about, it's really a maximizing process. Mm-hmm. What it's really maximizing is your reproduction, and sometimes it's complicated to find out what exactly will be the behavior that maximizes your reproduction. Mm-hmm. And of course, some of you know that I think that most of our intelligence is just probably sexually selected. But so in other words, it's just to impress other people for one reason or another. It's nothing to do with actual food finding or anything like that. But whether or not that's true, right? The question is, what good does intelligence, now I'm using the definition of intelligence that Lynn probably doesn't like, but in this hand wavy way, the thing that you get with more effortful thinking or with more thinking, what is it that actually achieves? Like what, if it achieves no benefit, it's no wonder we don't want to do it. But why do we think, or what do we think it actually does? It's not totally clear, right?
Yeah.
And actually in terms of anthropology, I know there's some anthropologists here. We don't really know in human evolution what was it that made us evolve those brains that can do that stuff.
Yeah. Am I unmuted?
So
I guess not.
She changed her mind.
Okay, she answered it. And Heidi says she has to go. I think there's no question there.
Heidi says she has lots of questions, but another time. Okay, everybody who's here and those online, if you'd like to join me, let's have a round.
Thank you very much. And thanks for attending the talk in person or on Zoom. It's great to see some faces from the past again.
Thank you. Fabulous, Anna.
Thank you.
Can you hear me, Anna? Probably not, huh?